Revelation chapter 17. We're going to actually split this chapter into two halves. So this morning is really kind of a part one. Next week will be part two. We are in our study nearing the end of the Great Tribulation. We saw last week in chapter 16, 7 angels pouring out what John said were the 7 last plagues of God's judgment upon the earth. And he says, in them the wrath of God is complete. Now, this morning is another one of these zoom in chapters. John's going to swap out the wide angle lens, and he's going to zoom in not so much on a particular character of the Great Tribulation, but a particular aspect of planet Earth during these final 7 years of judgment. He's going to do this really over the next 2 chapters, and what he's going to highlight for us is this: Babylon. Now, Babylon is really more of a concept. We've seen it mentioned a couple of times already in our study. Back in chapter 14, there was an angel flying through the sky declaring, Babylon is fallen, that great city, because she has made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. Towards the end of last week's study, in chapter 16, verse 19, John says, great Babylon was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. And in the next 2 chapters, the idea of Babylon, perhaps more specifically, the idea of the fall of Babylon, will be mentioned almost half a dozen times. So what we're going to do this morning, we're going to read the first 6 verses of chapter 17, and then we're going to pause and start making some comments. Okay, verse 1, John writes, then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and talked with me, saying, come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters. Verse 2, with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. Excuse me. In verse 3, John says, so he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness. And John says, there I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. This woman, he says in verse 4, was arrayed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the filthiness of her fornication. Verse 5 says, on her forehead a name was written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. John says, I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, he says, I marveled with great amazement. Now, this is going to seem a little strange, but where I'm going to start is by reminding everyone of the very first mention of the gospel in the entire Bible. It's all the way back in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. It's referred to as the proto-evangelium. It's when the Lord is pronouncing a curse upon the serpent, Satan. He says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Take note of the fact that the seed of the woman is referred to as a he or a his. Charles Spurgeon says, this is the first gospel sermon that was ever delivered upon the surface of the earth, a memorable discourse indeed, with Jehovah himself for the preacher, the whole human race, and the prince of darkness for the audience. David Guzik adds, this prophecy gives the first hint of the virgin birth, declaring the Messiah, the deliverer, would be the seed, literally the sperma of the woman, not of the man. And there's good reason to believe that understanding of this began to spread as the human race propagated. A simple example of this is in the very next chapter of the Bible, Genesis chapter 4. Adam and Eve have a son, and Eve names him Cain. Now, the name Cain means, I've got him, or here he is. Again, Bible commentator David Guzik writes, it's likely that Eve thought Cain was the seed that God promised, the deliverer. There is a sense in which Eve said, I have the man from the Lord. And there's all kinds of cultural evidence that demonstrates down through history, mankind had an understanding that God would eventually send a savior, a Messiah, a deliverer. But back to Babylon. Babylon is mentioned 287 times in the Bible, more than any other city except for Jerusalem. It was a literal city that was located along the banks of the Euphrates River. Prophetically, John Walvoord writes, Babylon sometimes refers to a literal city, sometimes it refers to a religious system, and sometimes it refers to a political system, but they all stem from a literal and historic Babylon. Now in Genesis chapter 9, when Noah and his family came off the ark, here's what God commanded them. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. That was God's desire. Spread out. Essentially, he tells them, repopulate the planet. Now, from there, you go to Genesis chapter 10, and we find what's called the Table of Nations. There's a famous archaeologist by the name of Indiana Jones. I'm kidding. His name's William F. Albright. He writes, the 10th chapter of Genesis stands absolutely alone in ancient literature without a remote parallel, even among the Greeks, where we find the closest approach to a distribution of peoples in genealogical framework. The Table of Nations in Genesis chapter 10 remains an astonishingly accurate document. Geographic names that spring from this chapter abound. Modern day linguists have no trouble taking the names of countries and people groups around the planet today and tying them back to Genesis chapter 10. Now, among the peoples and nations listed there is one of Noah's great grandsons. His name is Nimrod. Here's what Genesis chapter 10 has to say about him. Nimrod began to be a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore, it is said, like Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And then we read this, the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, or Babylon. So keep that in mind. There is, in formal Bible study, that which is known as typology. Typology is a special kind of symbolism where a person or thing in the Old Testament foreshadows or pictures a person or a thing in the New Testament. Strong's Exhaustive Concordance defines it as something in messianic times which answers to a type in the Old Testament. And Nimrod, all the way back in the first book of the Bible, can be seen as a type or a prefigure, a foreshadowing of the coming global end times leader known as the Antichrist. For starters, Nimrod's name means we will rebel. The repeated phrase before the Lord, where we read that Nimrod was a mighty hunter before the Lord, it's not a flattering description. It literally means in the face of the Lord. The idea is that Nimrod was an offense to God. James Montgomery Boyce writes, this is not talking about Nimrod's ability to hunt wild game. He was a hunter of men, a warrior, a tyrant. It was Nimrod's ability to fight and kill and rule that his kingdom of the Euphrates Valley city-states was consolidated. And again, Genesis 10:10 says the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. Now, Adam Clarke points out, now this is important, stay with me. This is the first mention in the Bible of a kingdom on earth that's associated with a human leader. Because there is also in Bible study that which is known as the principle of first mention. The idea is if you really want to have a good understanding about something, you go to the first place it's mentioned in the Bible and you read what it has to say. So for instance, when you really want to have a good understanding about marriage, go to the first place it's mentioned in the Bible. When you want to have a good understanding about the church, go to the first place it's mentioned in the Bible. This is the first earthly kingdom in the Bible. It's under the rulership of this man, Nimrod, whose name means we will rebel, and it's Babylon. And what did they do at Babel or at Babylon? Genesis 11 says, they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They had brick for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. They said, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. Okay, so when Noah and his family come off the ark, God commands them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. But at Babel, they say, lest we be scattered over the face of the earth. In other words, they don't want to do what God commanded. Also, when Noah came off the ark, God promised Noah he would never again destroy the earth with a flood. But interestingly, at Babel, you got a group of people who don't want to scatter. And what are they building? They're building a tower. And verse 3 says they had brick for stone and they had asphalt for mortar. That word asphalt, it's a very important word. It's bitumen. It's the same material that God told Noah to use to waterproof the ark. It's also the same material that Moses' mother used to waterproof the basket. Okay, so let me ask you a question. Why do you suppose there's a group of people out in the middle of a desert building a waterproof tower unless they had somehow been convinced that God could not be trusted? That even though God said he would never destroy the earth again with a flood, that, you know what, just to be safe, just as a little bit of an insurance policy, why don't we do this? Why don't we build ourselves a waterproof tower in case God changes his mind? Now, somebody's thinking, Kevin, that's a little bit of a stretch. Listen to what Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, who was not a Christian, by the way, listen to what he writes in his Antiquities of the Jews. It was Nimrod who excited men to such an affront and contempt of God. He persuaded them not to ascribe it to God as if it were through his means they were happy, but to believe it was their own courage which procured that happiness. Nimrod changed the government into a tyranny, seeing no other way of turning men from God but to bring them into a constant dependence on his power. He said he would be revenged on God if God should have a mind to drown the world again, and for that, he would build a tower too high for the waters to reach. The multitude were ready to follow the determination of Nimrod and to esteem it a piece of cowardice to submit to God, and they built a tower cemented together with mortar made of bitumen that it might not be liable to admit water. So in Genesis, the very first book of the Bible, you read about the world's first dictator, a tyrant who sways the world into allegiance to himself, and the first kingdom associated with him, and it's called Babel or Babylon. Now, in the book of Revelation, we read about a final coming world dictator who will sway the world into allegiance with himself, and the name of his kingdom is referred to as Babylon. And throughout the Old Testament, Babylon is associated with idolatry, blasphemy, child sacrifice, the persecution of God's people. Merrill C. Tenney writes, to the Jews, Babylon was the essence of all evil, the embodiment of cruelty, the foe of God's people, and a lasting symbol of sin, carnality, lust, and greed. David Guzik writes, for now, it's enough to see Babylon in Revelation chapter 17 as representing mankind in an end times organized rebellion against God. But what does this woman of Revelation chapter 17 have to do with any of this, right? In verse 6, John says, when I saw her, I marveled with great amazement. So let's take note of a couple of things about this woman. In verse 1, the angel says to John, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters. So take note of that. One of the great things about the book of Revelation, we've said this before, is that it often interprets itself. And if you just let your eyes drop down to verse 15, if you don't want to do that, I'll put it on the big screen for you. John says, the angel said, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. So she sits on many waters, and then he tells us straight up what the waters are. It's basically the planet. It's everybody on the earth. So check this out. This woman has a global presence. Okay, in verse 3, John says, I saw the woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of names of blasphemy, having, note this, 7 heads and 10 horns. Now, if you've been studying with us, we've heard that before. Back in chapter 13, John introduces the Antichrist. And he says, I saw a beast rising out of the sea, having what? 7 heads and 10 horns. So clearly, this woman of Revelation chapter 17 is connected to the Antichrist and or his government. And the government of the Antichrist will be connected to a specific city, which means the woman will be as well. I'll show you what I mean. The beast has 7 heads, right? We just read that in verse 3. Verse 9, check out what John writes. He says, here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. Another translation of the Bible reads, the 7 heads represent 7 hills upon which the woman sits. And then down in verse 18 of chapter 17, we read the woman who you saw is that great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. Now, historically speaking, there has only been one city that has been known as the city of 7 hills. That city is Rome. An ancient historian by the name of Horace wrote of the gods who look with favor on the 7 hills. Ovid said, Rome looks around on the whole globe from her 7 mountains. The Catholic Encyclopedia states, it is within the city of Rome, called the City of 7 Hills, that the entire area of Vatican State proper is now confined. So it's fairly certain that the city of Rome is what's in view in these verses. Adam Clarke said, this verse has almost been universally considered to allude to the 7 hills upon which Rome originally stood. In fact, you can go online, you can research the actual names of the 7 hills in the city of Rome. Aventine Hill, Palatine Hill, Viminal Hill. I can't pronounce them all, but there's several others. Now, we've talked about this before. The government of the Antichrist will be very closely associated with what we often hear referred to as a revived, a revived Roman Empire, most likely the European Union or some form of the European Union. The European Union started as the Club of Rome. They met in Rome. They signed the Treaty of Rome. Guys, all you have to do is look at the EU Parliamentary Building in Strasbourg. It is literally based upon the reconstruction of the Tower of Babel. And the symbol of Europe is Europa, which is a woman riding a bull. It's depicted in many statues around the nations. It's on several EU coins, so it's just kind of interesting. Now, back in verse 4, there's a physical description of this woman. John says, the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup and full of abominations and the filthiness of her fornication. In verse 5, John refers to her as a mother. Now, quickly, let your eyes jump ahead to chapter 18 and take a look at the end of verse 7. Again, if you don't want to do that, I'll put it for you on the big screen. John says this woman, follow me on this, says in her heart, I sit as queen. Okay, now think about this for just a moment. Is there a woman who has a global presence, who is associated with worship, closely connected with the city of Rome, often referred to as a mother who calls herself queen, who appears in purple and scarlet and gold and precious stones and holding a golden cup in her hand? But here's the last one, who is also connected to ancient Babylon, right? Because that's the last one, right? John says, emblazoned upon her head, it says, Babylon the Great. You see, if it weren't for this last one right now, I'm sure there's people in the room or watching online, I would be ticking off because they'd be saying, wait a minute, Kevin, are you saying that the mother of harlots mentioned in Revelation chapter 17 is the Virgin Mary? Or perhaps more specifically, the Roman Catholic idea of the Virgin Mary? And I would say this, not exactly. It's something much bigger and older and more sinister than that. Here's probably the best quote about this. Joseph Seiss writes this, that Rome and the Romish system are involved must be readily admitted, but that this is all, and that the fall of Great Babylon is simply the fall of Romanism or the destruction of the city of Rome alone must be emphatically denied. David Hocking writes, the woman pictures all false religion that dominates the world in the tribulation period. However, there must be no question that the Marian movement, as it is called, or the worship of the appearances of the Virgin Mary, are extremely popular. Okay, now this probably isn't that big of a deal here in the United States. But when you get outside the United States, remember, I lived in Ireland for 10 years, which is 98% Roman Catholic. Listen to some of these numbers. These are real, genuine numbers. An estimated 10 to 15 million followers of Mary visit a single Marian shrine in Guadalupe every year. 30 million pilgrims have visited Medjugorje since the apparitions began in 1981. 5.5 million pilgrims visit a single apparition site in Lourdes, France annually. Poland's Marian shrine draws an estimated 5 million pilgrims a year. Total annual attendance at Fatima, Portugal is estimated to be 4.5 million and growing. Thousands of people from over 70 countries and 6 continents gather every year in Amsterdam to celebrate the International Day of Prayer and the Lady and Mother of all nations. Newsweek magazine ran a cover story on the Virgin Mary, and they said the 20th century belongs to Mary. From almost every continent, visionaries report more than 400 apparitions of the Virgin Mary. Taken together, these visions point to what the Marian movement believes is a millennial age of Mary. By the way, listen to some of the messages that the supposed appearance of the Virgin Mary is bringing. These are actual quotes from apparition sites around the world. I alone am able to save you from the calamities which approach. Those who place their confidence in me will be saved. The world is denigrating so much that the Father and Son sent me into the world among all peoples in order to be their advocate and to save them. My daughter, in this time, I am the ark of salvation, the ark where my children must enter if they wish to live in the kingdom of God. And listen, while we might expect this phenomenon to occur in countries that are predominantly Roman Catholic, there are apparitions of the Virgin Mary being reported in Japan, Africa, Korea, Australia, Iraq, Israel, Egypt, Syria, India, and they all have one thing in common. They're all allegedly being visited by a woman who calls herself, listen, the Queen of Heaven. And these are the messages that she brings. Now listen, stick a pin in that for a moment, okay? Because let me ask a question. In Jeremiah chapter 7 and Jeremiah chapter 44, we read accounts of people worshiping a deity known as the Queen of Heaven. Jeremiah says, the children gather wood and the fathers kindle the fire. The women knead the dough to make cakes for the Queen of Heaven. In chapter 44, we can read specifically of them burning incense to her and pouring out drink offerings to her, making cakes for her and worshiping her. So if the woman pictured in Revelation chapter 17 is the apparition of the Virgin Mary, and the most commonly ascribed name to her is the Queen of Heaven, how is it possible we can turn to the pages of Scripture and read about people worshiping the Queen of Heaven 600 years before the birth of Jesus? Which means long before the Roman Catholic Church ever came into existence. The answer is simple. It's because the deity known as the Queen of Heaven existed as a woman being worshiped long before Roman Catholicism ever came into the picture, and it all goes back to Babylon. Okay, now listen. Time prevents me this morning from doing a deep dive into this, okay? So I'm going to skim along the surface. But I would say this, if you really want to do a deep dive into this, you can go to our YouTube channel. You can look up a Bible study called Who is the Queen of Heaven? It is by far the most popular Bible study on our YouTube channel with over 17,000 views. Okay, this is a topic that people like to look into. But again, this morning, I'm going to skim the surface, and I got to go quick because I know we're running out of time, but I beseech you, stay with me, follow me, and think about this. Remember Nimrod, who I started talking about this morning? The first tyrant mentioned in the Bible, the beginning of whose kingdom was Babel, who swayed the people not to trust in God. Check this out. Nimrod had a wife named Semiramis. And according to legend and what we've been able to piece together through history, she was originally the keeper of a brothel, meaning she was a harlot. And Nimrod took her to be his queen. Now, it didn't look too good to have an ex-harlot on the throne, right? And so a story was invented, check this out, that Semiramis was a virgin who sprang from the sea at Nimrod's feet. Now, when Nimrod died, Semiramis had an illegitimate son. She named him Tammuz. By the way, in the book of Ezekiel, you can read about people worshiping Tammuz. Semiramis actually convinced people that Tammuz was Nimrod reborn, and check this out, that he had been conceived supernaturally. So before long, in addition to worshiping Tammuz, or Nimrod reborn, people started worshiping Semiramis as a goddess of fertility since she had conceived miraculously. So she assumes the rulership of her infant son. She ends up ruling for 42 years, and eventually she has herself installed as the Queen of Heaven. And the story of the mother and child was commonly reported throughout ancient Babylon. It developed into a formal system of worship. We read her name inscribed on some of the gates of Babylon. There are numerous monuments that depict mother goddess worship of Semiramis with Tammuz in her arms and people worshiping the mother of the child. Now, again, this all started at Babel. But remember what happened in Genesis chapter 11. God comes down and judges the people, and they scatter over the face of the earth. And as people moved into other lands, they inevitably took their pagan practices with them, including this worship of the mother and the child. So you'd think then that we would see evidence of mother-child worship in different cultures around the world. And guess what? We absolutely do. When you examine culture and history, there have been many nations that worshiped a mother and child in one form or another centuries before the birth of Jesus. For instance, the Chinese had a mother goddess called Xingmu, or Holy Mother. The ancient Germans worshiped the Virgin Hertha with the child in her arms. The Scandinavians called her Disa, and she was also pictured with a child. The Etruscans called her Nutria. Among the Druids, the Virgo Patatura was worshipped as the mother of God. In India, she was known as Indrani. The mother goddess was known as Aphrodite to the Greeks, Nana to the Sumerians. In Egypt, the mother was known as Isis and her child as Horus. In Asia, the mother was known as Sibyl and the child as Dios. But regardless of her name or place, says one writer, she was the wife of Nimrod, who eventually became known as Baal, the virgin queen of heaven who bore fruit, although she never conceived. And this false worship, which started in Babylon, eventually came to Rome. One historian said the worship of the Great Mother was very popular in the Roman Empire. Inscriptions prove that the two, the mother and child, received divine honors not only in Italy and especially at Rome, but also in Africa, Spain, Portugal, France, Germany, and Bulgaria. And over time, this became what we know of as Marian worship today. Guys, listen, even non-Christian writers recognize this. Listen to just a few of these quotes. From a book called The Divine Feminine, one author offers this insight into why Marian apparitions are embraced by people from almost every religious background. Those who know only the Christian traditions do not know how deep the roots of Mary go, or how the prayers to her echo the immemorial prayers to ancient goddesses. The words echo the greeting addressed 4,000 years ago to the goddesses Inanna, Ishtar, and Isis. Millions of people, particularly women, have prayed to Mary as they once did to Ishtar, Hathor, Isis, and Huan Yin, giving thanks to her for safe delivery in childbirth and leaving countless tokens of gratitude in her shrines for answers to their appeals for help. There is virtually no end to the documentation that exists with regard to the importance of female deities to the religions and cultures around the world. Though she may come under different names or titles, many researchers believe this is the same entity. From the goddess reawakening, the presence of the goddess herself has never departed from our consciousness. And now, as we enter what many feel to be a new age, we sense that the goddess is making her way back to us. But in just what guise is so far unclear. In Sophia, goddess of wisdom, we read nothing is going to delay the goddess's second coming. Whether in the guise of Sophia or any other form, the reemergence of the goddess has begun to break down conceptual barriers. And for the first time in 2 millennia, the idea of a goddess as a central pivot of creation is finding a welcome response. One more from Rebirth of the Goddess. One of the most unexpected developments of the 20th century is the rebirth of the religion of the goddess. In America, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand, hundreds of thousands of women and increasing numbers of men brought up in biblical religions are rediscovering the language, symbols, and rituals of the goddess. So you can see where this woman in Revelation chapter 17 transcends religious and cultural barriers and how she represents a coming global idolatrous end times religion. So Kevin, what are you suggesting? Are you suggesting that Satan, because of what was prophesied in Genesis chapter 3 about the coming of the Messiah through the seed of a woman, and in an attempt to throw people off from the very beginning in anticipation of Christianity, actually created a false system of religion where people worshiped the mother rather than the child. And because mankind was united as one at Babel, it could be thought of as a global religion. And when God came down and confused the languages, the people took with them into those cultures. And within those cultures, we find the common threads of a mother goddess worship. And because it's there, embedded into all these different cultures, but ultimately all stemming from the one place, Babylon, the enemy will be able to, in the last days, awaken this same common thread from within all different religious cultures, and this acceptance of a mother goddess worship is going to be one of the primary uniting factors of the world into a global community once again during the last days. Kevin, is that what you're saying? Yes. That's exactly what I'm saying. In fact, I'm saying it's already happening. In fact, I would be so bold, and I'm sure I'll make somebody mad when I say this, but I would be so bold as to suggest that one of the reasons we have seen a meteoric rise in what I'll call aggressive feminism in just the past few years is in anticipation of this. It's priming the world to want to unite under a strong female presence. But this is also why, in passages like Revelation chapter 17, listen, while obviously closely associated with what we think of as the Roman Catholic version of Mary, it's why it's referred back to Babylon the Great, the mother of all harlots, because ultimately it goes much further back than Roman Catholicism, all the way to Babylon. But why? Why would the Antichrist need and use this type of false, unifying religious element to seal his kingdom during the last days? Well, in verse 7, the angel says to John, I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and 10 horns. So that is where we're going to pick it up next week. So you got to come back for chapter 2 of Revelation chapter 17. But I encourage you to read ahead. Go check out that study I mentioned on our YouTube channel. Do a deep dive into this. You'll be fascinated when you start seeing it, how this is already happening around the globe.